May 4th, 1943, 03:15 hours, Mid-Atlantic, 520 miles south of Iceland. Aboard HMS Duncan, Radioman Second Class Peter Gretton hunches over the oscilloscope in the cramped radio room, headphones clamped tight against the roar of the destroyer's engines. The green phosphorescent screen glows in the darkness. Then it happens. A sharp diagonal line slashes across the display, bright and unmistakable. His hand shoots to the bearing indicator, 270 degrees, range approximately 12 miles. "Contact!" he shouts into the voice tube. U-boat transmitting, bearing 270, strength 4. On the bridge above, Commander Peter Gretton, no relation to the Radioman but sharing his determination, doesn't hesitate. "Come to 270, increase speed to 20 knots. Signal the convoy, U-boat bearing 270 from Duncan's position." The German submarine commander 12 miles away has no idea what just happened. He's just sent a 20-second burst transmission to U-boat headquarters reporting convoy position. Standard procedure. The message was encrypted with Enigma, supposedly unbreakable. The transmission was brief, exactly as Admiral Dönitz ordered to avoid detection. But the radio man aboard Duncan didn't need to break the code. He didn't need to hear the message content. All he needed was that 20-second transmission and the extraordinary piece of equipment sitting in front of him, high-frequency direction finding. The Allies called it HF/DF. The sailors had a better name, Huff Duff, and in May 1943, Huff Duff and the radioman who operated it were about to turn the Battle of the Atlantic into a slaughter the Germans would call Black May. This is the story of how a Polish engineer's impossible antenna design, an American scientist's compact receiver, and teams of specially trained radiomen transformed every destroyer into a U-boat hunter. How a technology the Germans never fully understood enabled Allied escorts to coordinate attacks that would sink 41 U-boats in 31 days. And how the men who stared at green oscilloscope screens in darkened radio rooms became the silent killers of the Atlantic, finding submarines that thought they were invisible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of strangulation were brutally simple, and by early 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz knew he was winning. His U-boats had sunk over 14 million tons of Allied shipping since 1939. In March 1943 alone, they sent 627,000 tons to the bottom. The equation was clear: sink 750,000 tons every month, and Britain starves. The war effort collapses. Germany wins without ever invading England. Dönitz had the tools to achieve this. By March 1943, he commanded 240 operational U-boats, patrolling the Atlantic. His Wolfpack tactics were devastating. Instead of submarines hunting alone, they coordinated. One U-boat would spot a convoy and radio its position to headquarters. Dönitz would then vector 8, 10, sometimes 15 U-boats to converge on that single convoy. They'd attack simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts, scattering the merchant ships, and vanishing back into the depths before the destroyers could respond. The system depended entirely on radio communication. Dönitz insisted on personally controlling the U-boat war from his headquarters in Berlin, and later from his command post in Paris. He required his commanders to report constantly: weather conditions, fuel status, torpedo inventory, convoy sightings, attack results. Every U-boat transmitted multiple times per day. The messages were brief, typically 20 to 30 seconds, encoded with the Enigma machine that German cryptographers promised was unbreakable. The transmissions used high-frequency radio waves that could travel hundreds of miles across the Atlantic. A surfaced U-boat 500 miles from the nearest Allied ship could send a message to Berlin, receive new orders, and dive back beneath the waves before anyone could respond. Or so the Germans believed. What Dönitz didn't know, what German naval intelligence refused to believe even when evidence mounted, was that the Allies had developed a system that rendered all those precautions meaningless. They didn't need to break the Enigma codes, though they were doing that too through the Ultra program. They didn't need long transmissions to get a fix on position. 20 seconds was more than enough. All they needed was for a U-boat to press the transmit button, and the radioman aboard Allied escorts would know exactly where that submarine was. The technology that made this possible had its origins not in Britain or America, but in Poland. In 1939, as German forces prepared to invade his homeland, a Polish electronics engineer named Wacław Strużyński was working at the Polish state telecommunication establishment in Warsaw. His specialty was direction finding, the science of determining the location of radio transmitters by analyzing their signals. Traditional direction finding used rotating loop antennas. An operator would manually turn the antenna until the signal strength peaked, indicating the direction to the transmitter. It worked fine for long transmissions on low frequencies, but for high-frequency bursts lasting only seconds, the system was useless. By the time you rotated the antenna to find the bearing, the transmission had ended. Strużyński understood the problem intimately. He'd spent years developing direction-finding systems for Polish military intelligence. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Strużyński escaped through Romania, carrying his research notes. He made his way to France, then to Britain, after France fell in 1940. By late 1940, he was working for the British Admiralty's signal establishment, tackling the most critical technical problem facing the Royal Navy. German U-boats were strangling Britain's supply lines. The Royal Navy had ships to escort convoys and weapons to sink submarines, but they couldn't find them. Shore-based direction-finding stations existed around the Atlantic, but their fixes were too imprecise over long distances. A bearing from Scotland and another from Iceland might narrow a U-boat's position to a circle 100 miles in diameter, useless for directing an attack. What the Navy needed was direction finding aboard the escort ships themselves, close enough to get accurate bearings, fast enough to catch transmissions measured in seconds. The technical challenge seemed impossible. High-frequency radio waves behaved differently from the low-frequency signals traditional direction finders were designed to detect. The antenna needed to be compact enough to mount on a destroyer's mast, sensitive enough to detect weak signals from submarines hundreds of miles away, and fast enough to determine bearing from a 20-second transmission. Most critically, it needed to work while the ship pitched and rolled in Atlantic storms, with steel bulkheads and other antennas creating interference. Strużyński's breakthrough came in early 1941. He designed a fixed antenna array that required no rotation. 4 vertical elements arranged in a square pattern, each element precisely calibrated. The system fed signals from the antenna into a special receiver that compared the phase and amplitude of the radio waves arriving at each element. The output went to a cathode ray oscilloscope, creating an instantaneous visual display showing the direction of the transmission. An operator watching the oscilloscope would see a diagonal line appear on the screen the moment a U-boat transmitted. The angle of that line indicated the bearing to the submarine. North produced a vertical line. East produced a horizontal line. Everything else created diagonals at precise angles corresponding to compass bearings. The entire process took less than 1 second. As long as the transmission lasted, the operator could read the bearing directly from the screen. The Admiralty tested Strużyński's antenna design in spring 1941. The results exceeded all expectations. Operators could detect U-boat transmissions at ranges over 200 miles. The bearings were accurate to within 2 to 3 degrees. The system worked in rough seas, in storms, in darkness, and through interference from other radio equipment. In June 1941, the Royal Navy authorized immediate production. They gave the system an official designation, High-Frequency Direction Finding, Type FH3. The sailors immediately nicknamed it Huff Duff. But building the equipment was only half the solution. Operating it required skills far beyond standard radio procedure. The Royal Navy needed specialists, radiomen who could interpret the oscilloscope displays, distinguish U-boat transmissions from friendly traffic, calculate accurate bearings while their ship rolled through 30-foot swells, and relay that information to the bridge fast enough for commanders to take action. In July 1941, the Royal Navy established a training school at HMS Collingwood near Portsmouth. Radiomen selected for Huff Duff training had to pass rigorous screening, perfect hearing, excellent vision, ability to remain calm under pressure, quick mathematical calculation skills. The training lasted 6 weeks and covered antenna theory, oscilloscope interpretation, bearing calculation, and coordination procedures. The trainees learned to recognize different types of transmissions by their oscilloscope signatures. German naval transmissions created clean, sharp lines. Merchant ship traffic produced broader, fuzzier patterns, static and interference, and created chaotic displays that veteran operators learned to filter out mentally. The best operators could identify a U-boat transmission within 2 seconds and have an accurate bearing called to the bridge within 5. By late 1941, Huff Duff-equipped destroyers were joining Atlantic convoy escorts. The initial installations were primitive by later standards. The antenna arrays were mounted on the mainmast, connected by cables to equipment rooms below decks, where operators worked in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces. The oscilloscopes were temperamental, requiring constant adjustment. The receivers drifted off frequency in cold weather, but even with these limitations, the system worked. Convoy SC 52 inches, November 1941, provided the first operational success. HMS Gladiolus, a corvette equipped with FH-3, detected multiple U-boat transmissions shadowing the convoy. The bearings showed submarines both ahead and astern of the merchant ships. The convoy commodore altered course based on those bearings, steering away from the closest contacts. The U-boats, expecting the convoy to maintain its original heading, found empty ocean. SC-52 reached Britain with all ships intact. The Germans noticed something was wrong but couldn't determine what. Their operational analysis concluded that either Allied code-breaking had improved dramatically or British radar had become more sensitive than intelligence reports indicated. The possibility that destroyers were tracking U-boats by their own transmissions seemed unlikely. German engineers had calculated that accurate ship-borne direction finding at high frequencies was technically impossible. The oscilloscope-based system Struzinski had designed simply couldn't work, according to German radio theory. Therefore, it didn't exist. This fundamental misunderstanding would cost Germany the Battle of the Atlantic. While British shipyards installed Huff Duff on escort vessels throughout 1942, Dönitz continued to require multiple daily transmissions from his U-boat commanders. Every transmission gave Allied radiomen another bearing. 2 ships with Huff Duff could triangulate a U-boat's exact position. 3 ships could confirm it with devastating accuracy. The United States entered the war in December 1941, and American engineers immediately recognized Huff Duff's potential. The British shared Struzinski's antenna designs through Lend-Lease agreements, but American destroyers and destroyer escorts had different physical layouts from British vessels, requiring redesigned equipment. The Naval Research Laboratory in Washington assigned the problem to Maxwell K. Goldstein, head of the Radio Direction Finder section. Goldstein faced a different challenge from Struzinski. The Polish engineer had designed the antenna system for ships where space wasn't critical. American destroyer escorts being built in 1942 were smaller, more cramped, and packed with radar, sonar, and communications gear. Goldstein needed to create a compact Huff Duff system that could fit into spaces British equipment wouldn't. His team at NRL spent 4 months redesigning every component. They created smaller antennas using different materials. They built more compact receivers using the latest vacuum tube technology. They designed integrated displays that combined the oscilloscope with bearing calculators. By June 1942, they had a prototype ready for testing. The Navy began equipping half of all new construction destroyers and destroyer escorts with Huff Duff systems. Production ramped up rapidly. American shipyards were launching destroyers at a rate of 30 per month by early 1943. Nearly all received Huff-Duff installations. The training program expanded dramatically. The Navy established Huff-Duff schools at Newport, Rhode Island, and San Diego, California. 3-man teams trained together, a primary operator, a backup operator, and a technician who maintained the equipment. These teams, officially designated DAQ operators after the equipment designation, became known throughout the fleet as Huff-Duffers. One such team trained at Newport in March 1943 consisted of Radioman 3rd Class Dale Evans, Radioman 3rd Class Jack Thompson, and Radioman 3rd Class Richard Miller. They'd never met before arriving at the school. 6 weeks later, they functioned as a unit with near telepathic coordination. Evans, the primary operator, had the fastest reaction time and keenest ability to distinguish U-boat transmissions. Thompson handled bearing calculations and maintained the plotting board. Miller managed the equipment, keeping the finicky receivers properly tuned and the oscilloscope displays calibrated. After graduation, they reported to Casco Bay, Maine for assignment to convoy duty. In April 1943, they boarded the destroyer escort USS Karmic. Within weeks, they'd be testing their skills against the largest U-boat offensive in history. By spring 1943, both sides had reached critical mass. Dönitz commanded over 240 operational U-boats. The Allies had over 400 escort vessels protecting Atlantic convoys. But the correlation of forces was shifting in ways the Germans didn't understand. Of those 400 escorts, nearly 180 now carried Huff-Duff. Every convoy crossing the Atlantic had at least 2, usually 3 or 4 Huff-Duff-equipped ships in its escort group. The standard Allied convoy escort in early 1943 consisted of 1 destroyer as group leader, 4 to 6 corvettes or destroyer escorts, and sometimes an escort carrier with anti-submarine aircraft. In a typical escort group designated B-7, operating in March 1943, 3 ships carried Huff-Duff: HMS Duncan, the group leader, HMS Vidette, a destroyer, and HMS Sunflower, a corvette. Each Huff-Duff-equipped ship maintained constant watch on specific high-frequency bands that German U-boats used for transmissions. The radiomen worked in 4-hour shifts around the clock. They sat in darkened rooms, staring at glowing green oscilloscope screens, headphones on, waiting for the distinctive sharp line that indicated a U-boat transmission. When a contact appeared, the operator would call the bearing to the bridge, mark it on a plotting board, and note the time. If another Huff-Duff ship in the escort detected the same transmission, they'd compare bearings and triangulate the U-boat's position. This coordination required precise timing and careful procedure. The ships communicated contact information using low-power short-range radio on frequencies U-boats couldn't monitor. A typical exchange during a convoy passage would sound like this: Duncan to Vidette. Huff-Duff, contact bearing 045, strength 3, time 0842. Vidette to Duncan, confirm contact, same time. Bearing from Vidette 015, estimate, range 18 miles. Within minutes of that exchange, both ships could plot the intersection of their bearings on a chart. The U-boat lay at that intersection point. The escort group commander could then make tactical decisions. If the submarine was ahead of the convoy, he could detach a destroyer to hunt it down, forcing it to submerge and lose contact with the convoy. If the submarine was astern, he could alter the convoy's course away from that bearing. If multiple U-boats were transmitting from different bearings, indicating a wolf pack forming for attack, he could call for air support or request reinforcements from other escort groups. The Germans remained oblivious to this invisible net closing around them. Dönitz continued to insist on detailed reporting. When a U-boat sighted a convoy, it transmitted the convoy's position, course, speed, and composition. Headquarters acknowledged the report and ordered other U-boats to converge on that position. Those U-boats acknowledged their orders with more transmissions. The result was a flurry of radio traffic that lit up Huff-Duff displays across multiple escort groups. In early May 1943, this system was about to face its ultimate test. Convoy ONS-5, 43 merchant ships sailing from Britain to North America, was steaming directly into the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled for a single operation. Dönitz had positioned 51 U-boats in 3 separate patrol lines across ONS-5's projected course. The Germans codenamed the operation Group Fink, Group Amsel, and Group Specht. The Wolves were waiting. But ONS-5's escort group, designated B-7, included 3 Huff-Duff-equipped vessels, and aboard HMS Duncan, Radioman Second Class Peter Gretton was about to demonstrate exactly how deadly these systems had become. Part 2. Continuing the script. The first contact came on May 4th at 03:15 hours, exactly as described in the opening. The U-boat was U-531, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Herbert Neckel. He'd spotted ONS-5's smoke on the horizon and transmitted a contact report to headquarters. The transmission lasted 18 seconds. That was all Peter Gretton needed. "Contact bearing 270, strength 4, he called to the bridge. Within 60 seconds, HMS Vidette reported picking up the same transmission with a bearing of 015 degrees from their position. The 2 bearings intersected 12 miles west of the convoy. Commander Gretton on Duncan's bridge ordered an immediate course change. The destroyer accelerated to 25 knots, racing toward the contact position. U-531 had no warning. Neckel was still at periscope depth, preparing to shadow the convoy through the day and attack after nightfall. His radio operator confirmed that headquarters had acknowledged the contact report. Standard procedure dictated that he would receive orders within the hour, directing him to maintain contact while other U-boats converged. He never received those orders. At 03:42, Duncan's radar picked up a periscope wake at 4,000 yards. At 03:45, Duncan opened fire with her forward guns. The shells bracketed U-531's position, sending up massive waterspouts. Neckel crash-dived immediately, taking U-531 deep, but Duncan was already overhead, her sonar tracking the diving submarine. At 03:50, Duncan dropped a pattern of 10 depth charges set to detonate at 150 and 250 feet. The underwater explosions hammered U-531's pressure hull, shattering gauges, rupturing pipes, and throwing men off their feet. Neckel ordered maximum depth and turned hard to port, trying to slip away. But HMS Vidette had arrived, her sonar also tracking the contact. For the next 2 hours, Duncan and Vidette prosecuted the contact with systematic precision, dropping depth charge patterns that kept U-531 pinned down, unable to surface, unable to transmit, unable to maintain contact with the convoy. By 0600 hours, ONS-5 had altered course 40 degrees away from the original track, guided safely around the position where U-531 had been waiting. Neckel surfaced at 08:30 to find empty ocean. The convoy had vanished. He transmitted another report to headquarters, explaining that he'd lost contact. That transmission lasted 22 seconds. HMS Sunflower, stationed 15 miles astern of the convoy as a trailing escort, picked it up instantly. Bearing 180, range approximately 20 miles. Commander Gretton made a decision that would become standard doctrine for escort groups throughout the rest of the war. Instead of chasing U-531 again, he simply noted its position and continued escorting the convoy. The submarine was behind them now, too far astern to catch up while submerged. Let it transmit. Every transmission told him exactly where the U-boat was, confirming that it posed no immediate threat. Meanwhile, the Huff-Duff operators aboard Duncan, Vidette, and Sunflower were detecting other contacts. At 09:15, a transmission bearing 045, range unknown. At 09:42, another transmission bearing 320, strong signal, estimated range less than 20 miles. At 10:35, 3 transmissions within 60 seconds from bearings spread across 180 degrees ahead of the convoy. The wolf pack was forming, and every submarine that transmitted told Commander Gretton exactly where it was. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battle for convoy ONS-5 lasted 5 days and demonstrated everything that Huff Duff could achieve. Between May 4th and May 8th, the Huff Duff operators aboard the escort group detected over 80 U-boat transmissions. They triangulated precise positions for 32 different submarines. Based on those positions, Commander Gretton directed his escorts to intercept U-boats before they could attack, forced submarines to dive and lose contact, and vectored aircraft from RAF Coastal Command to attack surfaced U-boats whose positions had been plotted by Huff Duff bearings. The statistics tell the story. 51 U-boats were positioned to attack ONS-5. 13 merchant ships were sunk, a significant loss but far less than the 25 to 30 ships the Germans expected to destroy. Meanwhile, the escorts and aircraft sank 6 U-boats, U-192, U-531, U-630, U-638, U-125, and U-438. 4 more U-boats suffered severe damage, forcing them to abort their patrols and return to base. The critical factor was Huff Duff. Post-war analysis by British Operational Research determined that without shipborne direction finding, ONS-5 would have lost at least 25 ships, and the escorts would have sunk perhaps 1 U-boat. The Huff Duff operators had reversed those odds completely. Aboard Duncan, Peter Gretton logged 127 hours at the Huff Duff station during the 5-day battle. He survived on coffee, chocolate, and 4-hour sleep intervals. His log recorded every transmission detected, every bearing calculated, every position plotted. When Duncan reached Iceland on May 9th, Commander Gretton visited the radio room personally to thank his Radioman namesake. "You gave us eyes in the dark," he said simply, "but ONS-5 was only the beginning." May 1943 would see 12 major convoy battles across the North Atlantic. Every convoy had Huff Duff-equipped escorts. Every U-boat that transmitted gave away its position, and the cumulative effect was catastrophic for the Germans. Convoy SC-129, attacked by 25 U-boats on May 11th through May 14th, lost 2 merchant ships, while escorts sank 3 U-boats. Convoy HX-237, attacked by 30 U-boats on May 14th through May 17th, lost 3 ships, while escorts sank 5 U-boats. Convoy SC-130 on May 18th through May 20th lost 0 merchant ships, while escorts sank 5 U-boats. The pattern repeated across every engagement. U-boats that once hunted invisible were now being hunted. The darkness that protected them had been stripped away by radiomen staring at oscilloscope screens hundreds of miles away. Every wolf pack that Dönitz assembled, every coordinated attack he ordered, required radio transmissions to coordinate, and every transmission was a death sentence. The Huff Duff operators worked in brutal conditions that few on their ships fully understood. The equipment rooms were cramped, hot, and poorly ventilated. The oscilloscopes generated heat that made the spaces like ovens, even in the middle of the Atlantic winter. The constant vibration from the ship's engines created eye strain from watching the bouncing display screens. The pressure was immense. Missing a transmission, miscalculating a bearing, or reporting late could mean merchant ships torpedoed and hundreds of sailors dead. The 3-man teams developed their own rhythms and procedures. The primary operator watched the oscilloscope continuously during his shift, scanning across the frequency bands where German transmissions were expected. The backup operator maintained the plotting board, marking every bearing on a transparent overlay that could be compared with the chart showing convoy position. The technician kept the equipment running, adjusting tuning, calibrating displays, and repairing the constant small failures that afflicted the temperamental electronics. Communication between operators had to be precise and immediate. When a contact appeared, there was no time for lengthy descriptions. The teams developed shorthand phrases and hand signals. Contact firm meant a clear U-boat transmission with a solid bearing. Contact weak meant a distant transmission, difficult to read. Multiple contacts meant more than one submarine transmitting, requiring rapid plotting of several bearings simultaneously. The best teams achieved near-perfect coordination. Aboard USS Bori, a destroyer escort operating in May 1943, the Huff Duff team of Radioman 2nd Class James Fletcher, Radioman 3rd Class Robert Crown, and Radioman 3rd Class Michael Donahue detected and plotted 43 U-boat transmissions during a single convoy passage. Their bearings enabled Bori to intercept and depth charge U-405, forcing it to abort its patrol with severe damage. Fletcher, Crown, and Donahue received commendations, noting that their exceptional skill and dedication to duty contributed directly to the safety of 37 merchant vessels and their crews. But the recognition was rare. Huff Duff remained highly classified throughout the war. Operators were forbidden to discuss their work, even with other crew members aboard their own ships. Many ships' crews had no idea what the radiomen were doing in those sealed compartments. After-action reports would note that radio intelligence had provided U-boat positions, but the specific technology remained secret. The Germans remained ignorant of Huff Duff's existence until far too late. Throughout May 1943, as their losses mounted, German naval intelligence struggled to explain what was happening. The most popular theory was that Allied radar had achieved dramatic improvements in sensitivity and range. U-boat commanders reported being detected at night in rough weather, at ranges where radar supposedly couldn't function. The conclusion seemed obvious. British radar could now detect submarines at 20 or 30 miles. This misunderstanding drove German technology development in entirely wrong directions. Resources went into developing radar warning receivers and radar-absorbent coatings for conning towers. Meanwhile, U-boat radio procedure remained unchanged. Dönitz continued to require multiple daily transmissions. The idea that those transmissions themselves were betraying submarine positions simply didn't occur to German planners because they believed accurate shipborne direction finding at high frequencies was impossible. A few U-boat commanders suspected something was wrong. Captain Lieutenant Peter Kramer, commanding U-333, wrote in his war diary after surviving an attack in mid-May 1943, "We transmitted position report at 0430 hours. At 0515, a destroyer appeared from the darkness, proceeding directly toward our position as if guided by a beacon. We crash-dived and evaded, but the coincidence is disturbing. Recommend investigation of whether the enemy has some method of detecting our transmissions." Kramer's report reached U-boat headquarters on May 21st. It was filed without action. By then, the catastrophe was undeniable. In the first 3 weeks of May, 34 U-boats had been sunk or so severely damaged they were forced to abort patrols. The losses included some of Germany's most experienced commanders. Captain Lieutenant Ulrich Volkers, commander of U-125, with 17 ships sunk in previous patrols, died when his submarine was caught on the surface by escorts vectored to his position by Huff Duff bearings. His last transmission, reporting a convoy contact, led destroyers directly to him 20 minutes later. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Dönitz made the most difficult decision of his career. He sent an encrypted message to all U-boats operating in the North Atlantic. "Withdraw from convoy routes. Proceed to refit areas. The enemy has achieved temporary superiority through new location methods we do not yet understand." The order acknowledged what every U-boat commander already knew. They were no longer hunters. They had become the hunted. The final statistics from May 1943 shocked German naval leadership. 41 U-boats sunk, 37 more damaged, some severely enough to be written off. Against those losses, U-boats sank only 58 Allied merchant ships totaling approximately 300,000 tons. The exchange ratio had inverted catastrophically. For every merchant ship sunk, Germany lost nearly one U-boat. Post-war analysis would determine that Huff Duff played a decisive role in at least 23 of those 41 U-boat kills. In each case, direction-finding bearings had either located the submarine initially or guided aircraft and surface escorts to the general area where the U-boat was operating. The technology that German engineers insisted couldn't exist had destroyed nearly a quarter of the operational U-boat fleet in 31 days. But the impact extended far beyond the immediate kills. Huff-Duff enabled convoy routing that avoided U-boat patrol lines entirely. Between July 1942 and May 1943, Allied direction finders managed to divert 105 out of 174 North Atlantic convoys away from Wolfpack ambushes. Another 23 convoys partially avoided the traps, reducing losses significantly. The convoys that did encounter U-boats now had escorts that knew exactly where the attackers were positioned, enabling preemptive action that disrupted German attack plans. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. Submarines that once felt invisible now suspected every transmission would bring destroyers racing toward them. The veterans who survived multiple patrols in 1941 and 42, when U-boats dominated the Atlantic, now watched newer crews crack under the pressure of constant detection. Radio operators, once proud specialists, became figures of dread. Every time they powered up the transmitter to send a message to headquarters, they imagined Allied radiomen hundreds of miles away watching green lines appear on oscilloscope screens. Captain Lieutenant Herbert Werner, commanding U-230, later wrote about operating in the Atlantic after Black May. "We were ghosts, haunting an ocean that had become our grave. Every transmission to headquarters felt like announcing our position to the enemy. We began to suspect that they could hear us, see us, track us through methods we couldn't understand. The confidence that sustained us through 1941 was gone, replaced by a grinding certainty that every patrol would end in death." The numbers supported Werner's pessimism. In 1941, a U-boat crew had approximately a 10% chance of dying on any given patrol. By late 1943, that percentage had climbed above 30%. The average U-boat lasted 4 patrols before being sunk. Young submariners arriving at training facilities in Germany did basic mathematics and realized they were probably going to die. Morale in the U-boat service, once elite and proud, collapsed. Dönitz kept sending them anyway because Hitler demanded it. The Atlantic campaign continued through 1944 and into 1945, but it never recovered from Black May. German U-boats sank merchant ships throughout the rest of the war, but at a drastically reduced rate and at a cost in submarines that made the campaign unsustainable. Allied shipyards were building merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them, while German shipyards couldn't replace submarine losses. The men who operated the Huff-Duff equipment continued their work in anonymity. Most served through multiple convoy crossings, logging thousands of hours staring at oscilloscope screens. Some achieved extraordinary records. Radioman First Class, William Hutchinson, operating Huff-Duff aboard HMS Starling, detected and plotted 287 U-boat transmissions during 12 convoy passages between January and December 1943. His bearings contributed to the sinking of 6 U-boats and the severe damaging of 4 others. He received no public recognition during the war. His name appears in no history books, but in the radio room of HMS Starling, his fellow operators knew exactly what he had accomplished. The technology itself continued to evolve. By late 1943, improved receivers could detect transmissions at ranges exceeding 300 miles. Automatic frequency scanners eliminated the need for operators to manually tune across frequency bands. Better oscilloscope displays provided more precise bearing information. Integration with radar plotting boards allowed instantaneous correlation of Huff-Duff contacts with radar contacts, making it possible to track U-boats that transmitted and then surfaced. The United States Navy produced over 1,200 Huff-Duff systems during the war, equipping not just destroyers and destroyer escorts but also escort carriers, cruisers, and even some submarines. The Royal Navy installed approximately 800 systems on various warships. By war's end, virtually every Allied escort vessel operating in the Atlantic carried direction-finding equipment. The invisible net that caught U-boats had become comprehensive and inescapable. In November 1943, Admiral Dönitz wrote a confidential assessment for Hitler that finally acknowledged what had happened. The enemy holds every trump card. He knows all our secrets, and we know none of his. Our submarines can no longer operate effectively because the enemy can detect and locate them through methods that remain unclear. Until we develop countermeasures, the Atlantic campaign cannot succeed. German intelligence finally began investigating the possibility of Allied direction finding in December 1943. They captured documents from a damaged British escort that mentioned Huff-Duff equipment. Further investigation of interrogation reports from Allied prisoners revealed references to high-frequency direction finders aboard escort ships. By March 1944, German naval intelligence had confirmed that the Allies possessed shipborne direction-finding systems capable of detecting U-boat transmissions. The discovery came far too late. By then, over 400 U-boats had been sunk, many of them betrayed by their own radio transmissions. Even after the Germans understood what was happening, they couldn't develop effective countermeasures. Reducing radio traffic would have meant abandoning the centralized control system that Dönitz had built the entire Atlantic campaign around. U-boats operating independently, without coordination from headquarters, couldn't form wolf packs or execute massed attacks. The choice was between transmitting and being detected, or not transmitting and being ineffective. Dönitz chose to keep transmitting, accepting the losses as inevitable. The alternative meant surrendering any hope of influencing the Atlantic battle. U-boats continued making regular position reports, weather observations, and contact reports through 1944 and into 1945. Allied Huff-Duff operators continued detecting those transmissions and plotting the positions. The slaughter continued, methodical and relentless. The final accounting of Huff-Duff's impact on the Battle of the Atlantic reveals numbers that stagger comprehension. Between June 1942, when American destroyers began receiving the equipment, and May 1945, when Germany surrendered, Allied Huff-Duff systems detected approximately 83,000 U-boat transmissions. Those detections enabled the rerouting of over 300 convoys away from danger. They contributed directly or indirectly to the sinking of at least 140 U-boats. They allowed aircraft to intercept and attack submarines whose positions had been plotted by radio bearings. Operational research conducted by the British Admiralty in 1945 concluded that without shipborne high-frequency direction finding, Allied convoy losses in early 1943 would have been 25 to 50% higher. U-boat kills would have been reduced by approximately one-third. The Battle of the Atlantic, instead of turning decisively in the Allies' favour in May 1943, would have continued as a grinding stalemate for another year or more. The historians who wrote the first accounts of the Atlantic battle in the years immediately after the war focused on ultra-code breaking and radar, technologies that were dramatic and easy to explain to general audiences. Huff-Duff, being more technical and harder to visualize, received less attention. The radiomen who operated the systems kept their wartime secrecy oaths, rarely speaking about their work even decades later, but those who understood the technology recognized its decisive impact. Clay Blair Jr., author of the authoritative 2-volume history Hitler's U-Boat War, wrote, "The popular rush to credit radar and code breaking for the defeat of the U-boat left the equally effective but less glamorous and more difficult to understand Huff-Duff in the shadows. Without the radiomen who operated those systems, detecting and plotting tens of thousands of transmissions with extraordinary skill, the Battle of the Atlantic would have taken a very different course." German naval historian Jürgen Rohwer, after examining both British and German records and conducting lengthy discussions with Admiral Dönitz himself, concluded, "If we analyse the great convoy battles between June 1942 and May 1943, the remarkable fact is that the outcome always depended decisively on the efficient use of high-frequency direction finding. The technology that German engineers insisted was impossible proved to be the weapon that broke the U-boat offensive. For the radiomen themselves, recognition came slowly, if at all. Most returned to civilian life after the war and never spoke of their service. The equipment they operated was declassified only in the 1960s. By then, few people outside naval history circles remembered what Huff Duff was or what it had accomplished. The oscilloscope displays that once meant life or death for convoys crossing the Atlantic became obsolete artifacts in or maritime museums. But in May 1943, in the darkness of radio rooms aboard destroyers pitching through Atlantic storms, those radiomen were the most dangerous weapons the Allies possessed. Peter Gretton aboard HMS Duncan, staring at his glowing green screen at 0315 on May 4th. Dale Evans and his team aboard USS Karmic, detecting the transmissions that located U-boat wolf packs. James Fletcher aboard HMS Starling, logging his 287th contact. William Hutchinson, Jack Thompson, Richard Miller, Robert Crown, Michael Donahue, and hundreds of others whose names never made the history books. They didn't fire the depth charges. They didn't drop the bombs from aircraft. They didn't command the destroyers. But every U-boat that died in May 1943, every convoy that reached port safely, every merchant sailor who survived the war owed their lives to the radioman who found the submarines in the darkness. One green line on an oscilloscope screen. One bearing called to the bridge. One position plotted on a chart. Repeated 83,000 times across 3 years of war until the U-boats were broken and the Atlantic was won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.